All right. Welcome to the afternoon session. We have two speakers now. Both talks are 20 minutes. The first one is Suchin Gururangan.
Yep.
With Annotation Artifacts and Natural Language Inference data.
All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Suchin, graduate student at the University of Washington. This is going to be a project called Annotation Artifacts and Natural Language Inference Data. Here with my co-first author, Swayamdipta. And this is joint work with Omer, Levy, Roy Schwartz, Sam Bowman, and Noah Smith. So who here works with crowdsourced annotations? Or maybe works with data sets on crowdsourced annotations? Yeah, so this is a really popular sort of area of NLP, and it really drives a lot of modern NLP. And so, we're usually given some text, we have a model, and we have some output here. It's hard to or it's easy to forget that there are humans behind the text and that data that we feed our models to. And those annotators, because they are human, they have their own biases. They have their own beliefs about the world, they have personal motives, they have their own cultural backgrounds. And this affects the distributions that we see in our data. And there's been a lot of conversation about how biases affect downstream societal applications. But a sort of long-running theme of this talk is that biases also affect how we evaluate models and our design of our tasks. So the story sort of starts with the natural language inference task, which I think a lot of people here are familiar with. Basically, you're given two sentences, a premise and a hypothesis. And the goal is to determine whether that premise entails that hypothesis. So there are three categories. So for example, if you're given the premise Northwest NLP workshop is being held at Microsoft headquarters. You have an entailment category. The workshop is in Redmond, because that's definitely true given this premise. A contradiction that Amazon is hosting the workshop, because that can't be true. And a neutral example that Satya Nadella is attending the workshop. I don't know if he's here. So these are relatively well-defined classes, and it's really apt for annotation. We've had a lot of really great performance on this task over the past few years. The Stanford NLI and multi-NLI datasets were released in the past couple of years. And people have been getting scores in the 70s and 80s across these two datasets. And so a newcomer to this particular area of NLP might see these scores and be like, OK, there's not really much else to do in NLI. Like, what am I doing here? But I think the results of this paper kind of show that there is a lot to do. Most NLI models, especially the top performing ones, sort of represent both the premise and the hypothesis in some sort of joint way, feed that joint representation down to a classifier to predict those three labels. What we found, very interestingly, is that if you completely disregard the premise and only consider the hypothesis, only feed the hypothesis into that classifier and make the same predictions, you can do really well on this task. The classifier that we used in this particular experiment was FastText, which is an off-the-shelf text categorization model from Facebook. Models those words as bigrams, unigrams, very, very simple. We were able to get 67% accuracy on SNLI and about 55% accuracy on multi-NLI. And this is kind of harrowing. This tells us that those datasets aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing. We don't really need to learn entailment to perform about 2x above our majority baselines. And so the sort of project that we embarked on was really to answer this question of why we're able to do so well on this task with just the hypothesis. We showed that elicited annotations induce lexical clues, which we call annotation artifacts, that reveal the entailment class. We showed that supervised models, especially the top performing ones, exploit these annotation artifacts to make their predictions. And we present the wider implications for model evaluation and task design. And so even though this talk is very centered on sort of NLI data, hopefully anyone who's working with creating data sets using crowdsourced annotators or evaluating models in general can benefit from these results. So the first argument we had in our paper was that there exist annotation artifacts in NLI hypotheses that heavily correlate with the entailment class. And I'm going to kind of walk through how we showed that, but I think it's prudent to think about how these data sets are generated in the first place. So essentially, SNLI and multi-NLI are generated through sort of captions and source text from multiple genres that are fed to annotators on mTurk, who are then asked to create those three hypotheses, entailment, contradiction, and neutral. There's a real focus on scale here, both from the annotator's perspective as well as the task designer's perspective. The task designer wants as many examples as possible so we could feed those data-hungry neural nets. And annotators want to maximize the reward, annotate as many examples as possible. And SNLI and multi-NLI achieved about 1 million high-agreeing examples. And this is really great for this particular area of NLP because previous data sets either relied on expert annotators or relied on very specific theories of entailment that were very hard to scale. In this paper, under this framework, we showed that annotators are sort of trying to maximize their efficiency in creating these hypotheses and thus introducing these sort of heuristics and tricks to create examples that our models are trained on. And so I'm going to walk through some of the artifacts that we found in the paper. We quantitatively justify them in the paper, and there are a lot more artifacts that we show in the paper, so if you're interested, definitely check them out. So entailment artifacts included generalizations. We saw a lot of premises that are entailment hypotheses that were associated with premises like some men and boys are playing frisbee in a grassy area, and entailments having generalizations over entities in that text, people playing frisbee outdoors. We also see shortening, where specific words are removed from the premise. For example, here, the word shirt and the word green are removed to just create the entailment hypothesis. Neutral artifacts contain purpose clauses. For example, if two dogs are running through a field, the neutral hypothesis that was created was some puppies are running to catch a stick. Basically, an ambiguous situation was created by applying a reason to the premise. Modifiers were also really popular, where people just stuck sort of adjectives or superlatives in front of entities in the text, in the premise, to sort of create the neutral hypothesis. And contradictions had very, very consistent trends. Negation was really popular. This is one of my favorite examples because the premise is very intricate and complicated, has a lot of stuff going on, but the contradiction that they chose was nobody has a cat, which is really, really simple. And it's a valid form of entailment, but it's something that models could really, really easily pick up on. Cats were also really popular in the contradictions. The Flickr 30 dataset, which is what the SNLI data was derived from, contains a lot of dogs. And so people thought cats were contradictory to dogs. I sort of disagree with that, having a cat and a dog. But this is sort of the human belief and the sort of biases that get imbued into the dataset based on people's previous experience. So we've shown that artifacts exist. And the next argument of the paper is that supervised models, especially the top performing ones, exploit them to make their predictions. And the way that we showed this is we revisited the original model that motivated all this work, that hypothesis-only classifier that we were able to do really well on SNLI with and multi-NLI with. We basically fed in the test data for both multi-NLI and SNLI. And if the hypothesis-only classifier was able to get that example right by just using the hypothesis, we consider that example easy. And if it wasn't able to do it so, we consider it hard. And so in this way, we partitioned the test data into hard and easy subsets. And we also revisited the models that I originally showed that did really well on SNLI and multi-NLI. We basically tested these models on the easy and hard subsets and saw how they did. We basically showed that easy examples drove NLI performance. If you see a graph here, this is the accuracy of the same models. On the full data, we get about 87% accuracy. If you look at just the hard examples, the ones the hypothesis-only classifier was not able to get correct, the accuracy of those models drops pretty significantly, 10 to 20 points. And if you look at the easy examples, those models are able to do really, really well. So this kind of shows us the majority of the examples that these models are able to get right are the ones that have annotation artifacts. And we get very similar results in multi-NLI too. Check out the paper if you want to learn more. So given these results, I have a few closing thoughts. You can think of annotation artifacts as sampling bias. It's possible that, so I mean, it's crucial to know that none of these examples are invalid forms of entailment, right? They're all correct. They're just dominating the data set. These very easy lexical heuristics are dominating the data set. So it's possible that a good way to solve this problem is to sort of normalize the distribution of strategies that are used to create entailment hypotheses, not only using these lexical heuristics, but also using things like world knowledge or political perspective, or other forms of entailment that don't readily exist in that data set. Another really important thing to realize is that the reason this is a problem is that a lot of these models are very lexically driven, and they're very susceptible to these artifacts. What we want is a very general representation of entailment that is invariant to these artifacts. But what we see is that these models are making lexical associations between words and surface patterns, like Yejin was mentioning, to these labels. And so we have to really rethink about how we're modeling entailment to try to create representations that are really invariant to these problems that we see. Also, this is not just about NLI. This paper, I think, is a child of a series of papers that have come out recently thinking about data sets and critiquing how data sets are either created, how models can be easily broken based on by introducing adversarial examples. And I think that more work like this should be done. I think it's an important part of doing NLP that we're empirically driven and that we're sure that what we're measuring and evaluating models for are actually what they're learning. Lastly, I think progress in NLI has been overestimated. I think that there are a lot of open questions that sort of result of this work that are really focused on how we do better annotation. How can we direct annotators to avoid these simple heuristics when generating examples? Can we employ some sort of automated real-time sort of reward system that disincentivizes using simple heuristics? Are there alternatives to elicitation that can help us build entailment data sets? I think that there are a ton more open questions, and I'd love to talk to people about it if you're interested. We released the hard benchmarks on Kaggle and SNLI, so if you're interested in natural language inference, definitely encourage you to check these benchmarks out and test your models on both the full benchmarks as well as these hard subsets to see if you generalize across these artifacts. And thanks. Here's the link to my paper if you want.
Okay, we actually have lots of time for questions. Oh yeah, mic too. Okay.
Thanks. So are there interesting patterns to the hard examples, or are they more diverse?
Yeah, so we didn't include this in the paper because it's a very hard problem. But when you look at the hard subsets, it's not that they don't contain artifacts. It's that they contain very different types of skews from the easy subset. So for example, maybe you'd have a lot of examples in the hard subset where like not, the word not and negation is associated with a different class, like neutrals or entailments. And so it's kind of an open question about sort of how we utilize hard, quote unquote, hard training data in the best way. Is there a way to remove these artifacts? Yeah, it's hard to tell.
So one thing I was thinking about was...
Wait for a second so everyone can hear you.
Okay.
I could have done that last 2 meters.
So I was thinking specifically with the example of negation. Yeah. That seems one that's sort of like maybe would be like kind of natural to contradiction, you know, and maybe the reason people are like making those sentences like that is because that's such a natural way to like produce contradiction. So in that way, it seems kind of like that is like could be like a natural bias that you wouldn't want to like remove.
Right. Yeah.
So I was wondering, like some of them, like cat, obviously, like that is like a problem from the initial like data set. It seems like, but some of them seem less of like I was just
100%. And I mean, like none of these examples are invalid forms of entailment. Like they're all valid. I think the key is when we're evaluating our models, we got to make sure if we are saying that we're making a lot of progress on NLI, like what are we actually making progress on? Are we making progress on these easy lexical heuristics, or are we actually making progress on like general entailment, right? So it's really a question of how we build our data sets so we're evaluating our progress on these tasks in the best way possible.
So you define your easy examples as the one that your basic model was able to classify correctly. Mm-hmm. But do you make a difference between the ones that basically the examples that are actually easy versus the ones that the model picked up by chance?
We don't make that distinction. I think there's actually some work that my co-author Swabha was about to work on, with like creating better partitions of easy and hard subsets by using maybe like an adversarial model that is sort of online trying to classify both easy and hard examples, while another model is trying to actually perform entailment sort of predictions. I think this is really just a good first step into trying to build a better easy-hard subset, but there's definitely a lot more work to be done to create those partitions more accurately.
So you said this paper was part of kind of a series of papers. I was just kind of curious. Do you know, like, is there other research going on into artifacts and annotations, potentially for different problems, but similar data sources?
Yeah, I personally haven't seen much work in this area. I think that there's generally been a lot of work on how there was actually a lot of parallel work that had been done with other groups on the NLI data set, showing that not only are there biases with these sort of heuristics that people use, there's also biases in the context of like people are introducing stereotypes into the data, and I think those are separate problems. I'd say that this is definitely nascent work, and there needs to be more work done in this area too.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
More of a statement than a question. One strategy we've had, so we rely on Mechanical Turk for a lot of language data. One strategy we've had is to actually get users to filter themselves out. So you ask them questions that can become wrong, or say like their answers have to be XYZ length for your negation example, for instance. There might be further research and strategies into that, I suppose. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's. I feel like nowadays there's a lot of friction in like trying to create the sort of real-time interaction between annotators and like when they're creating these really huge data sets. And a lot of times you're not able to identify these problems until after the fact, right? And then it's too costly to go back and like recreate the data set. So I think like some sort of real-time way to review things in batches, or examples in batches, or something like you propose would be really influential.
It's an expensive problem.
Yeah.
Antoine, are you ready?
Okay, let's thank the speaker then.
So Yejin sort of teased a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this talk, which is pretty much neural networks, mouths without brains, also listeners without brains. Sort of goes both ways, and I'm sort of going to talk about how we can give them a brain. Yejin talked a lot about recipes, and I'm going to do so as well. I usually love to give this talk right before lunch because it's nice to see people squirm. But let's start by having you think about making an apple pie. When you bake a pie, there's a process that you follow in order to compose your raw ingredients into a final product. Intermediate steps such as slicing apples, cooking them, placing them in a pie sheet, and then baking the pie all have to be correctly navigated in the right order and with the right intermediate constructs if you're going to make something that's both edible and tasty. And understanding that process requires many common sense causal inferences to be made and remembered later on. First, once we slice the apples, we have to understand some notion that their shape has changed. When we saute them for a bit, we now know that their cookedness has changed, that their temperature has also likely changed to be warm, and also, despite having caused these new changes, we also still have to remember that they've been cut from before. That shape is still the same. We're no longer dealing with, we're not going back to having a raw apple that's had a completely new set of things done to it. Then when we add them to the pie sheet, we have to understand that there's actually a new entity that's been created from our sliced and cooked apples and the dough that we've now combined it with. And finally, once we throw it into the oven, we have to know that that combination of apples and pie sheet is now going to be cooked. So if we think about how current models, current intelligent agents might parse this information, current ubiquitous approach, use an LSTM, encode all the words into some type of sentence representation that's usually a single vector or a group of vectors, and you just sort of hope that that information can then be queried from that representation at a later step. That's not necessarily what happens, though. While LSTMs are sort of powerful representational tools, they don't do much more than encode surface word patterns, and they generally haven't been shown to capture more complex world dynamics that might be necessary for reasoning or some other downstream task that you want. Some more complex models, memory networks or entity networks, do allow for more fine-grained state representations because they generally split this encoded context across memory cells, which might allow you to retain processed information better or encode certain parts of your context in different ways. But they still don't capture any information beyond what's explicitly stated in the text. You're just learning text patterns and learning how to represent those in a particular way. So the problem with these approaches then is that the models we're building aren't ones that currently learn context representations that track the state of the world with all of the information that's needed to perform downstream tasks. Most neural state representations encode only surface patterns between tokens, and they generally devolve into encoding the most simple pattern that they can in order to get at the task that they're trying to do. So what might be a strong enough representation for some applications might not be good for another one right after. And so the reasoning that you use in one application might not be useful for what happens next in another one. So what we really want, ultimately, is for the representations that we learn to understand some underlying dynamic about the world and not just a dynamic about the task that we're training it on. And so this is why we decided to approach text understanding from a different paradigm. Understanding the state of the world means understanding that that world is entity-centric, and it involves identifying the state changes that those entities experience. And many of these state changes, however, might be knowledge-based as opposed to text-based. So instead of being explicitly mentioned in text, there might be an expectation of prior common sense knowledge that your model actually needs to know. So in this work, more specifically, we're going to address the following challenges. We're going to design a simulator that's entity-aware and that focuses on capturing information that describes changes to entities. So after reading any sentence in a recipe, we're going to choose an entity, apply a transformation to it, and then we're going to update a running representation of its state. And later, we should be able to predict attributes of this state based on an embedding that we're tracking and storing for it. And second, we're going to integrate common sense knowledge about physical state changes into the neural network by adding knowledge about action causality as a structural bias. So we're going to do this by allowing a predefined set of action embeddings to cause changes to our entity states. So raw text is actually only going to be used to select entities and select actions, and the actual simulation of the events that are described in the text is going to be done by applying these learned action functions to the entity state embeddings. So then the ultimate goal is really to learn a set of good action functions that can consistently induce the correct state changes in entities based on the text that's being read. And we're sort of going to do this in a two-step process. First, in order to develop a neural architecture that can learn these effects of actions that they have on entities, we're going to crowdsource a set of action state mappings. And then we're going to see how we can use this crowdsourced information to learn the parameters of a neural network that is structured to capture the inductive bias of how actions affect state changes in entities. So to crowdsource a set of action state mappings, not particularly interested, but we extracted a set of 380 verbs from the cooking domain that are mentioned fairly frequently. And then we manually compiled a set of 6 state changes that actions could entail. So location, composition, cleanliness, cookedness, temperature, and shape. And by using these state changes as supervision, we can learn the transformations that actions should induce in entities. So for each of the 384 actions, we actually crowdsource a set of state changes that action tends to induce in entities. So for an action like cut, we're generally going to expect to see a change in shape. For an action like boil, we're going to see a change in cookedness and in temperature, so you can have multiple state changes for the same action. Rinse involves a change in cleanliness, and stirring might involve a change in composition. And so then, now that we have this action state mapping knowledge, we come up with this model, which we call the neural process network because it models the processes that are described in text. which is a new neural network that decomposes the state tracking task into one of tracking actions and entities and learning the transformations that those actions are going to induce in the entities. And so to do this, the model actually keeps track of a set of state embeddings for the entities that it can change throughout the process, and a known set of action functions that can actually change those entities, and one of which corresponds to each of the actions that we crowdsourced earlier. So let me go over what the model is going to try to accomplish at a high level. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too many details about it because I really want to get to the results. But I'm actually going to focus in on a couple parts that I think are super interesting. So the first thing that happens is sort of typical, is that it's going to read in a sentence using some type of recurrent neural network, such as a GRU, and it's going to build a sentence representation for it. So in this case, I'm going to use this running example of cooking the beef in the pan to highlight a couple of things. Using this encoded representation from the encoder, it's going to select entities that are going to be changed by the events in the sentence, using an attention mechanism that sort of computes a binary choice over each individual entity. And this allows us to choose multiple entities to be changed in a particular sentence. So in this sentence, for cook the beef in the pan, it would choose the beef entity. Then the model is going to select an action that's going to be that it thinks is changing the entities it selected earlier in the sentence by computing an attention over the action functions that were initialized at the start. So here, it might select the action like cook. It might also select an action like put, because it recognized that pan is usually associated with a location change. And then inside this applicator function, it's actually going to compute a bilinear projection between this action embedding and this entity embedding and come up with a new state embedding that corresponds, that it thinks is a reflection of how this entity it selected earlier has been changed. So in essence, this is the step that understands that now some cooking action has been applied to the beef from earlier. And from that, it should actually be able to tell us what about this entity has changed using a set of classifiers, one for each of the state change types that we were tracking earlier. So in this case, the beef is now hot, it's now cooked, it's now in the pan. Meanwhile, there hasn't really been a change in cleanliness at all. And finally, it updates this information in the entity state embeddings so that the entity states reflect the state changes that the entities have experienced. Like I said, this involves a lot of neural networks. I'm not going to go into every single neuron specifically, but here's a couple things I want to highlight about it. First, when the model predicts the state changes that an entity has experienced, the errors from predicting those state changes get backpropagated back all the way to the action embeddings in the action selector, which allows us to learn representations of actions that are more likely to induce the correct state changes in the future. Second point I want to highlight is that when we update the entity state representations in the memory, we update each slot proportional to what its original attention was when we selected that entity. And what this does is that it allows us to model interesting compositional effects when two entities are mixed, for example. So because both slots might be selected at 100%, we're going to overwrite both of them with the same embedding that we got at the output, which allows us to pretty much reflect that these two things are now the same entity because they've been combined in a mixture. And the last thing I want to point out is this idea of recurrent attention. So in a sentence such as cook the beef in the pan, it's pretty clear which entity to select. That should be the beef. But if I all of a sudden change that sentence to cook it in a pan, all of a sudden it could refer to pretty much any entity. It really depends on what has been seen earlier because it's a co-referent. Right. So what we want to do instead is that we're going to allow the model to attend to previous attention steps so that it can select entities that have been selected prior, sort of an attention over attentions, in order to be able to select entities that were seen before. So there's a lot of details around data sets and training, but I encourage you to look at the paper for those. It's a very interesting paper. I wrote it. But what we've done here is what we've sort of done at a high level is to build a simulator that captures the dynamics of actions being taken in the cooking domain as it reads recipe lines. So the underlying task is really to read a recipe and be able to predict the entities that are changed and the state changes that they undergo in each step. So obviously, this leads to a great task of state change prediction. And we use the accuracy in F1 of predicting the correct state changes, and we weigh them by the accuracy of predicting the correct entities. And we're better than competitive neural baselines such as a GRU, which kind of we would expect to be, as well as the recurrent entity network, which is one of the best models on the BABI data sets for machine comprehension. And when we look at how well we choose entities, we see where this improvement actually comes from. So in the leftmost column, we see that we have a much better F1 score of predicting the correct entities at every step. And this actually is not necessarily because of how well we predict raw entities. So we do a bit better when we look at recall of predicting the raw ingredients compared to the two baselines. But it really, which is, raw ingredients would be something like predicting cut the tomatoes, and then even something like co-reference or elided arguments. But the big difference is really how we do in predicting composed entities. So if you think about something like combine the water and flour in a bowl, at the next step, if we have something like stir the mixture until a dough forms, it's really tough to know that that dough refers to this water and this flour, and we pretty much double performance that these baselines can actually manage at predicting these types of compositional entities, which is going to help us do a better job of tracking the state of entities overall. Just looking at examples here, melt butter in a medium saucepan over heat in the first step. Most models should be able to predict that the butter is being changed. In the second step, remove from heat, there's an elided argument, but we're able to predict that anyway. And in the third step, stir in oats, sugar, flour, all these fun things, we still understand that the butter is still there and needs to be combined with these things. If we look at something even more complex, step 1, brown meat in oil until it's brown on all sides. Step 2, pour off grease. We actually get this wrong. We predict that the oil should leave the mixture at this point, even though the gold says none. But if you think about grease and oil, probably fairly similar embeddings overall. And so it's conceivable that it could have left at the same time. Then in the next step, nothing particularly interesting. We predict all these directly named entities. But then the interesting part is in the step 4, where the line is bring to boil, then turn very low, cover, simmer about 1.5 hours, or until meat is tender. Meat should be fairly easy to predict as an ingredient that's being used here. It's explicitly mentioned in the text. What's interesting is that we actually predict all of these other ingredients that were combined with the meat in the previous step. So it's actually managed to figure out that this is actually a composition of all these entities, and it predicts them all together at the same time. And to show this effect a bit more quantitatively, if you remember how we select and update entities, we choose a set of entities, we average them, and then we apply the action function to them, and then we write the new embedding back to the correct memory slot, weighted by the original attention on that slot. So if two entities are selected, their embedding representations should usually move a lot closer to each other in embedding space because they're both being partially overwritten by the same vector. And as it turns out, if we look at the percentage change in cosine similarity of entity embeddings that are being combined, we can see that they're generally moving a lot closer to each other in embedding space. Now, for the skeptics among you, you can tell me that that's obvious. If you select all of them at the same time, at the first step, they'll all move a lot closer to each other in embedding space, so we should actually look at which ones aren't supposed to do that. And it turns out, if we superimpose that graph on this one, we can see that if you just actually select entities that aren't supposed to be combined in that step, they don't move close together at all in embedding space. There's obviously a bit of noise that leaks here and there, but with a good cutoff, you could probably get rid of most of that. So we're simulating entity effects fairly nicely. What about actions? Well, this entire model runs on the premise that action functions are applied to entity embeddings that induce state changes. If it works correctly, we would expect semantically similar actions to end up having similar action function embeddings. And that hypothesis is true. If we compare action functions in embedding space, they end up in a fairly nice part. So the cut action is near the slice, split, snap, splash. Mashing ends up being near spreading, pureeing, squeezing. So the internals of our model seem to be looking at the same patterns that we're trying to replicate. And finally, our state representations have to be useful for a downstream task. We have to show that our simulator can encode an advantageous representation of the process being described using the world information that we've provided to it. So we applied our state simulation model to recipe step generation. So at each step, we use the state embeddings of the entities to seed an LSTM generator, and we train it to generate the next step in the recipe. And across the board, our model, represented here in orange, does better than competitive baselines such as seek-to-seek or an attentive seek-to-seek, and it's consistent across metrics such as blue, rouge, as well as these metrics VF1 and SCF1, where we pretty much look at whether we generate the correct action in the next sentence or the correct state change in the next sentence. And interestingly, one of the baselines that we ran was using the entity state embeddings from the recurrent entity network tracker. So we used the tracker of the recurrent entity network, that baseline, which is also sort of learning this entity, this fine-grained entity representation, and we see how well the state embeddings that it encodes do on this task. And it does worse than the NPN across all metrics, indicating that the action-oriented simulation that we're using actually plays a role in encoding better state representations for downstream generation. And a quick example, if we see this recipe step generation with an ingredient such as butter, the first step is to preheat the oven to 425 degrees. these neural networks immediately jump to pretty common answers for something that requires preheating an oven, like lightly greasing baking pan with oil or combining all ingredients with mix and mix well. Our model knows that if you have some butter and it's raw, you're probably going to melt it, which is exactly what the reference is as well. So the takeaways, text only gets you so far. You really need a model of the world to do good understanding. You can encode these priors into a neural network architecture, and that model of the world can be learned from data. In future work, we're looking at stories, we're looking at dialogues, we're looking at scientific processes, and we're also looking at what type of models of the world can we encode to do better on these downstream tasks. And luckily for me, I work in a group that makes a lot of these models of the world. Between verb physics, connotation frames, and all these other things, there's a lot of data that we have to actually create these world models to do better in stories, dialogues, and scientific processes. So we're looking at encoding those into this pipeline. Thank you.
Since there's the coffee break right after that, I guess we have some time for questions.
I think there's one right there.
Thanks. Great presentation. I was just wondering if, because you're working on food recipes, if just because of the nature of food that you're picking up like single sense types of words. Mm-hmm. So when you say that, when you use that word entity, if you're kind of luckily referring to a particular sense, whereas if you put this into the wild, you might think things like, the house blew up when he was cooking meth, or salt in my wounds.
Great example.
Or, scratching the cherry car paint job, things
yeah.
like that.
So the question is, to simplify it down, will this generalize? So if we were looking at different domains besides just cooking, will something like this even work? So I would say that the simplified version of it, which we had for here with a fairly simple model of the world, where we just had 6 state changes applied to 385 verbs, in the cooking domain works, while you might need a much larger world to actually simulate for another task, so that you can actually capture all of those effects. And one of the things we're working on is using a larger lexicon of verbs, as well as a larger set of state mappings that those verbs can induce for tasks such as dialogue and stories.
Seems like this is a natural for incorporating outside ontologies. You learned all this just from reading recipes, but have you tried incorporating ontologies to know about things you haven't seen in a recipe before?
What type of ontologies are you suggesting?
Just a dictionary of what a carrot is, and that you never saw a parsnip recipe, but the ontology says
yeah,
a parsnip
so
is a root
we didn't do it in this work. In future work, it's one of the things that we're looking at. A lot of the lexicons we're trying to look at as being a model of our world are in fact ontologies that look at how different verbs, what effects they use. So we're using a lot of frame structures as models of our world.
Okay, the last question.
So, great talk. So, you did not elaborate on the data set much. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, so there are a lot of these videos of cooking online, or even some of these recipes have like intermediate like photos of different states. Could you do some kind of multimodal reasoning over this kind of?
Yeah, that was one of the goals that we were sort of looking at for future work, is how to integrate this, great and expansive data source of video and images, and how we could integrate that. And we're actually working with collaborators at Cornell right now who are looking into that sort of stuff, pretty much how you can represent the intermediate states using images, as opposed to maybe crowdsourced labels. So we're pretty excited about what's going on with that work. There's some amazing new data sets, and hopefully we'll be able to do something with it.
Okay, let's thanks the speaker again.